Okay.
So this, as a typical cardiac arrest, maybe 51% of the time, we're going to train to an officer arriving on scene with an AED, providing initial CPR. And this shows that this officer has applied the AED, no shock advised, and is performing compressions.
If it was a civilian, how would this have changed this scenario?
If the civilian is doing adequate compressions and has the ability to continue compressions, that officer will still apply the AED and potentially add an airway to this patient. If the civilian is looking tired and has been doing CPR for several minutes, the officer will still take over and continue compressions.
Does it happen very often that you're there before the police?
Rare.
Okay.
Police usually beat us. They're in their squads patrolling, so they have usually a better response time. Although for a few minutes, maybe 30% of the time, we might arrive with the ambulance maybe a minute, less than a minute before the police officers. So about the same time. We're talking pretty quick responses.
We're just going to be breathing.
All of our officers are either EMT or EMR. So they do have CPR training, and some of them are EMT.
Hold on one second. Can we mute the?
That's
a
good idea. There we go. Let's try that.
Okay. Start again then.
So our police officers are emergency medical responder or EMT trained. So they are trained in CPR, and we have trained with them before on medical emergencies, and we recognize that we need to train more specifically for the cardiac arrest. That will make this whole team, as they respond on every other medical that we go on, there is that good working relationship. So we just want to tune it in specifically to the first few minutes of cardiac arrest. As the first paramedics arrived, they brought the Eligard backpack and the Lucas backpack. Those are the only two pieces of equipment that they brought in. The reason why they only brought those two pieces of equipment is they are ready to go on the outside of the ambulance. They don't have, in the interest of speed to the patient's side, that's how they can most efficiently do that. They're not going into the back of the ambulance and putting the monitor, the airway bag, the extra equipment on top of the cot, unloading the cot, walking the cot down the sidewalk or across the yard into the elevators, because that takes a lot of extra time. If they can just take those two pieces of equipment, we know that we have more resources coming to this cardiac arrest. That'll be our, at least in our system, it'll be our engine. That'll be 3 more people. And we have good communication with them via our radios. We can say, we need the monitor, the cot setup, and whatever other equipment that they need. That happens as these guys are working on those vital first couple of minutes of the arrest. So that's why they do that. We also know that the police officer was there on scene prior to us. We know that he's got an AED. We recognize that electricity to a fibrillating heart is the best thing you can do for that cardiac arrest. So if that's there, we're going to utilize that as a shock, no shock. If the situation, the ambulance arrives first, they'll take those 2 backpacks and they'll send one person into the back to grab the monitor real quick, so we have the ability to deliver a shock if it's warranted. So we don't want to discount early defibrillation.
I found this on the web.
Siri is always listening. So
what are we seeing here?
Here we're seeing the paramedic take over compressions for the officer, who presumably has been doing compressions for at least a couple of minutes while we're getting there. he needs a break, we need strong compression, so we switch over. As we switch over, that officer is going to help the other medic continue to unpack those two backpacks and get ready to place the person on the Eligard. The communication between the medics and the officer should be, at this point, we're going to lift the patient up, I'm going to slide the Eligard underneath the head.
And what is the purpose of the Eligard board?
The board that the Eligard is on, that will place the person in the correct position and have the ability to lift once we are all set up and provide the elevated CPR.
And elevated CPR is relatively new.
Elevated CPR, we've been an early adopter and we've been doing it since about 2019, early 2019.
And what does the elevation give you that traditional CPR didn't?
Elevated CPR provides a method for oxygenated blood not only to perfuse the brain, but also return into the central circulatory system to re-oxygenate and go back to perfuse again. Generally, if you're doing CPR flat, the major vessels along the spinal column do not have valves. So with each compression, you're pushing a wave of blood into a vault, your skull. There's no other place for it to go. So it goes up and it doesn't have a place to drain. So each time it goes up, it just keeps forcing. So you're not actually perfusing, you're not circulating. Because of the body not having valves and pushing one way and coming out another. So what a slight amount of elevation will provide is you are pumping blood uphill, but as that blood goes up, it perfuses, it has a way to come back down, get back into the circulatory, so you're able to compress again. Some of it will go back up and then come back down. So you're not only draining a little bit, but you're also adding oxygenated blood. So normal cerebral perfusion pressures are achieved with this. The very, very important portion of this is you have to have the rescue pod, the impedance threshold device on top of your airway, a sealed airway. You also need to have a slow rate of rise and not too high. And that's what the Eligard provides. If you go up too fast, you lose the pressure head and you're not perfusing. If you go up too slow, it's too long and you're not doing as good of a job. So what the research and what the developers of this have discovered is a slow rise to just a little bit, just a few centimeters. And that provides the best bang for your buck, for lack of a better term. So
cool.
That's what they're doing here. If there's ever a time that you have to lift the patient up for a specific extrication, or if you have to take the rescue pod impedance threshold device off where you lose that pressure buildup, then you have to start over, lay the person flat again, create kind of the prime, make sure that everything has blood, your skull has blood in it, your brain has blood that can be drawn back, oxygenated and pushed. Then you start the rise over again. But as it's right here, we don't have the ITD on yet. I'll say ITD and rescue pod interchangeably, the impedance threshold device, or ITD. They're communicating that we're ready to place the Eligard underneath. We lift, support the head, place it underneath, and go back to compressions. The amount of time that the person was off the chest, if we count, it's minimal. 1, 2, 4 seconds. 4 to 5 seconds. Less than 6 is what we shoot for. Less than 5, great. The amount of time on the chest is what the person needs. Right now, the medic at the head of the bed, he's placing the eye gel, which is pre-packaged. So simultaneously, he's working on the airway by himself. And the other medic and the police officer are placing the Lucas device.
And the Lucas device, again, for those of us who don't know,
The Lucas device is an automated compression device that will compress at a predetermined rate and depth without getting tired, without stopping.
does the medic have to set those two variables depending on the situation, or is that a standard thing that all people get the same number of compressions and depth?
The medic will place the suction cup of the Lucas device. It's a piston-driven electric mechanical device.
Mm-hmm.
Suction cup goes center of the sternum, and it gets pressed down to the chest. So once it's at the chest, it will compress to it'll compress a couple 2 inches once it's at the chest. The Lucas 3 will also have a small amount of negative pull and then go right back. The rate itself is predetermined by the machine. You don't have to set that. It's a rate of about 100 per minute. And it's set it, press play. You can set it for continuous compressions, or you can set it for 30 compressions, pause for 2 breaths, go back to 30 compressions.
What do you typically do?
We keep it on continuous compressions.
The other question, yeah, so when it has the Lucas 3, that Lucas is like, say, a Kleenex, it's brand. So, but you mentioned that because that's active compression, decompression.
There is some decompression with, which is,
Yeah, so I want to go back to the iGel.
yes.
That the iGel is used to intubate because,
So we
as
use,
opposed to endotracheal.
right. So we use the iGel as a first airway. And you can see in it's a single person, it's fast. If you can see Eric place it, it takes from the time that he put lube on it to the time that it was in the mouth, seconds. Single digit seconds. We have the stack that you can see here with the ITD closest to the patient. We've also added our end-tidal CO2 monitor and the filter in that stack. So we're not opening packages and building it. Those are all pre-packaged, put together. So when Eric takes that iGel, which is a basic airway, supraglottic, that provides pretty good air, a pretty good seal in the airway, so that we can maintain what we want to have accomplished with the ITD, and that's to increase the intrathoracic pressure, so that when we're compressing the chest, the blood that's moving stays where it's supposed to stay until it's not. The best kind of description of the ITD is if you have a really long straw and the water level's low, you can draw water or fluid all the way up to the top, and if you have your thumb over the top of the straw, the fluid stays above the normal water line. You remove that thumb or the ITD and everything goes back down. So what the ITD is basically your thumb over the straw. A good seal in the airway is a good straw. We start with the iGel because it's fast. It's a basic airway, and it doesn't take more than one person to do it. We can intubate as a single person, but not efficiently. This is the most efficient way to get a good seal on the airway, a accomplish what we want to do with the rescue pod. And now that we have this started, and the Lucas device, the automated CPR device on, and the Eligard in place, we can start the process of priming the pump, getting blood flow to all of the vital organs, and at 2 minutes, we start to raise the head. And that's indicated by the blinking red light on the side of the machine near the patient's ears. And once that happens, that will slowly raise the patient's head and thorax. For our system, we'll have the next responding units bring in the advanced airway, and we might trade out the iGel into an endotracheal tube.
So it's from the first responders, then you've got the advanced life support team coming at that point. And they'll bring in the rest as we talked, like
Right.
IO and all that.
Yep. So if you'll, I mean, these are paramedics.
Yep.
But everything they've done up until this point is all basic life support. It's really fast, really good basic life support, at least to get the ball rolling. For us to negate any of the compressions and ventilations and electricity, which is all basic, we have to get that in place before we can start doing advanced life support. And that's what comes after this couple of minutes, where you start medication access, switch out that iGel for a endotracheal tube. The reason being, once we start moving a patient while providing resuscitation, it's very well known that it's not as good of a resuscitation when you start moving downstairs, through hallways. You just can't do as good of a resuscitation when you're moving. One thing that would happen with an iGel or any basic airway adjunct is that you'll lose that seal. It'll move, it'll adjust. A gold standard has always been the endotracheal tube, so if you can get an endotracheal tube, sealing that airway with the rescue pod, that's where we want to be. We also want to make sure that we're staying on scene. This only takes a couple of minutes to get this in place. We want to stay on scene for 25, 30 minutes. Watching the end tidal CO2, that's a good indicator as to how the arrest is going. If you have single digits and end tidal, the person may have been down for a longer period of time. But what we want and we hope for is a jump in end tidal CO2 and then a pulse check. That generally indicates a return of spontaneous circulation.
End tidal monitor will come with the second crew.
Yes. The end tidal monitor is a option on our Zoll cardiac monitor. So it's just it's already in that stack there. We don't have to take it apart. We just plug it into the side of the monitor and it will boot up and tell us what our end tidal is. How fast we're breathing for the patient to make sure that we're not breathing too fast or too slow.
The other advantage of the automated compression device is for transit, correct? Because that one is similar to the airway. That's a mess if you don't have that.
One of the other things so we've got these three right here. We're going to add 3 more, if not 4 or 5. When the medic goes to intubate, we want him to have a partner and someone to support him, kind of be his support person. We also want to take one person and put it on the Lucas device, on the automated compression device, especially when you start moving, because that is it's a mobile device. If that compression, that's not going to stop. That's the only drawback. It doesn't stop if it moves someplace it's not supposed to go. So if you can have one person take a Sharpie, mark around the chest so you have a visual, like it needs to stay within these lines, but then also have eyes on it the entire time. So especially when you're moving, they can have a hand on it, making sure that it doesn't rock or move or slide, the person doesn't slide. One of the things we have with the setup we have right here is, it's called a mega mover or patient litter. It's just a piece of canvas with handles on the sides. They're commercially made, and it's pre-folded underneath the Elegard. So at one of the next things that these folks will do is they'll slide that folded up piece of canvas out underneath, so now you have some way to lift the patient without rolling them on their side, trying to get something underneath. Because once again, anytime you're moving somebody during the resuscitation, the quality goes down.
Yeah, you're not doing this. The other thing, obviously, is safety for the paramedics if you're moving. Because if you're doing CPR,
As soon as you get into the back of that ambulance, that you don't have to have somebody that's unbuckled, straddling a cot, leaning over, while you're bouncing down the road, code 3 to the hospital. This way, you can stay seatbelted, you can still monitor where that compression device is. You can ventilate from the head of the bed, and you can push meds and monitor the compressions from a seatbelted side of the ambulance, side bench seat. So from that aspect, you can work an arrest in the back of an ambulance, essentially with 2 people. If you've got an automated vent, you can do it with a single. Generally, we'll work it with 3 or 4 to have support for things that go wrong, drawing up meds, confirming medications.
but like you said, it's not like the old days where you're literally riding a bucking bronco in the back, trying to hang on.
We can work an entire cardiac arrest with seatbelts. Once we have that next advanced life support engineer or fire engine that's going to bring in our equipment, we'll switch out onto our Zoll, our cardiac defibrillator. So it might be a pull off the AED and place our patches on, which is fine. We don't need to stop compressions. When we do find a shockable rhythm, we can continue compressions and shock as the compression device is going. So again, we're not stopping compression for hardly anything.
And switching out the AED is more of a safety thing than anything else, because you don't know the battery life of the one that's there. You don't know where it's been, kind of, but you know what yours is.
So we'll switch it out so we can actually see the rhythm.
Okay.
So most AEDs, they'll tell you shockable or non-shockable, and in the initial phase,